He was one of Germany's most respected battlefield commanders, a man praised by friend and rival alike, a man whose talent was so obvious that even the leadership in Berlin treated him like a prized asset. But behind the medals, behind the victories, and behind the image carefully crafted for the German public, this general was carrying a secret that would eventually cost him everything. His name was Walter von Brauchitsch, the commander-in-chief of the German army who tried to walk away from the conflict and paid the price. The story begins long before he ever clashed with the Western powers, before the Eastern Front swallowed entire divisions, before anyone imagined the conflict becoming a global storm. In the late 1930s, Walter von Brauchitsch was one of the rising stars of the military command system. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't political, he wasn't the kind of man who made speeches or sought attention. If anything, he preferred a quiet life. What made him valuable was his brain. He had an almost mathematical understanding of troop movement, logistics, and large-scale operations. For a leadership desperate to rebuild their military strength, he was exactly the kind of man they wanted near the top. But there was another side to him that the inner circle didn't see. Privately, he was constantly struggling with stress. The pressure of modern command weighed heavily on him. And the more the leadership in Berlin tightened its grip, the more he found himself caught between the demands of the political machine and the reality of the battlefield. He believed in discipline, not chaos. He believed in planning, not impulse. And so, from the very beginning, he found himself clashing with a leadership that preferred bold, risky moves over careful strategy. The turning point came during the push across Western Europe. To the outside world, this looked like the height of German power. Troops raced across borders with stunning speed. Armored columns tore through defenses that experts once said were impenetrable. The leadership called it destiny. The newspapers called it genius. But behind closed doors, Brauchitsch was already sounding alarms. He believed the campaign had succeeded, not because of flawless planning, but because of luck, hesitation from opposing commanders, and a series of last-minute improvisations that could have easily gone wrong. And while everyone else celebrated, he was staring at maps, worrying about overstretched supply lines, exhausted units, and a leadership that now believed anything was possible. This was the moment he began to realize the conflict was heading somewhere dark, and this was also the moment he tried to step away. Brauchitsch did something almost unthinkable for someone in his position. He quietly told the leadership he wanted to resign. He didn't make threats. He didn't argue. He simply said that the stress was overwhelming him, that he needed to step down for health reasons. It was the closest thing to an honest confession a high-ranking commander could make in that system. But the response he received made it clear that stepping away would not be an option. His resignation was denied immediately. For the leadership, a man like Brauchitsch wasn't just an officer, he was a useful symbol, a decorated career soldier, a pillar of the old military order, someone who gave their political plans a sense of legitimacy. Losing him would send the wrong message, so they told him to stay, and that was the beginning of the end. The next phase of the conflict forced him into an impossible position. As the military pushed eastward, he was expected to command operations that were far larger, far riskier, and far more demanding than anything the German army had ever attempted. But every time he gave a cautious recommendation, he was overruled. Every time he warned about winter conditions, manpower limits, or the staggering size of the Eastern Territory, he was brushed aside. He watched the leadership ignore intelligence reports, underestimate opponents, and assume that morale and willpower alone would make up for logistical reality. He knew the conflict was changing. He knew that the early victories had created dangerous illusions, and he knew that the leadership was unwilling to hear anything that contradicted their optimism. Brauchitsch's office became a place of tension. Officers would whisper concerns to him behind closed doors, yet none of them dared speak publicly. They hoped he would convince the leadership to reconsider their approach, But Brauchitsch had already learned that reason no longer mattered. The deeper the German forces moved into Eastern territory, the more desperate he became to walk away. By late 1941, he was suffering from intense stress, heart problems, and exhaustion. He collapsed more than once. His nerves were so worn down that he could barely sleep, and yet, whenever he tried to raise the issue of stepping down, he was told to stay quiet. The leadership needed a loyal face at the top of the army, especially one that didn't challenge them. Then came the breaking point. In December 1941, after a brutal winter counterstrike from the opposing armies, the German advance stalled. Units were freezing, starving, and unable to move. Commanders begged for withdrawal. Brauchitsch supported them, but the leadership refused, insisting that retreat was unacceptable. And when the situation collapsed, someone had to be blamed. Brauchitsch was dismissed in a single afternoon. The man who had tried to resign quietly long before the disaster was suddenly accused of lacking resolve, failing to control his generals and losing his nerve. The leadership made it sound as if he alone had jeopardized the campaign, ignoring the reality that they had overridden his warnings again and again. He was publicly humiliated. Privately, he was threatened. And after being removed, he was kept under surveillance for the rest of the conflict. If he had walked away earlier, he might have saved himself. If his resignation had been accepted, he might have spent the rest of his life as a retired officer, quietly forgotten. But the leadership was determined to make him an example. Once he was no longer useful, they blamed him for everything they could. And once the war ended, investigators discovered the truth. Brauchitsch had not been a ruthless fanatic. If anything, he was one of the last senior commanders who tried to resist the most extreme decisions. He disapproved of unlawful treatment of civilians. He opposed political interference in military planning. And he spent years trying to shield the army from the chaos that the leadership unleashed. But the system he served had already decided his fate. After the conflict ended, he was arrested, questioned, and prepared for trial. The charges were serious, and the investigations were thorough. But before the final judgment could be delivered, he suffered a severe heart episode in prison and passed away. The stress that had haunted him for years ultimately consumed him. He never got the chance to defend himself, never got the chance to explain that he had tried to step away long before the disaster. Never got the chance to reveal how many warnings he had given. History often remembers generals as symbols of power, men who shaped the course of nations through strength, confidence, and ambition. But Brauchittsch's story is almost the opposite. He was a man who tried to stop the momentum, who tried to step off the speeding train before it derailed. But once you were inside the machinery of that regime, there was no exit. Loyalty was demanded. Obedience was required, and hesitation was punished. His fate became a cautionary tale, not just about war, but about what happens when decisions are made by people who value ideology over reality and ego over expertise. Brauchitsch didn't lose his position because he was incompetent. He lost it because he was honest. He didn't fall because he failed to plan. He fell because he dared to question decisions that were leading millions into catastrophe. And the most tragic part is that he wasn't alone. Many commanders saw what was coming. Many tried to issue quiet warnings. Many attempted to resign, protest, or slow the pace of reckless decisions. But in a system that worshipped force and despised dissent, none of them were ever going to succeed. Brauchittsch's story is rarely told today because it doesn't fit neatly into the usual categories of heroes and villains. He wasn't a rebel or a visionary. He wasn't a mastermind behind any grand strategy. He was simply a career soldier caught in a machine he could not control. And the moment he showed hesitation, the moment he showed humanity, he was crushed by the very system that once praised him. His life became a reminder of something uncomfortable. Even at the highest levels of command, some men were prisoners of a regime that demanded loyalty above all else. Men who tried to pull the brakes only to discover that the train had no brakes left to pull. Braukic tried to quit the war. He tried to save his health, his conscience, and his sanity. But in the end, the price of walking away was far greater than the price of staying in. And that is what makes his story so shocking, because in most armies, a general resigning is simply a personnel decision. But in that world, stepping down was interpreted as betrayal, and betrayal had consequences. This is why history remembers his name not for his victories, not for his strategies, but for the one decision he tried to make. The decision to walk away from a conflict he knew was spiraling out of control. A decision he wasn't allowed to make. A decision that ultimately cost him everything.